Now that we understand the theoretical models that predict negative work incentives from welfare programs, let's look at what we know and how we know it about the size of these effects on work. We've seen that standard economic models predict that providing income support is likely to encourage more leisure. Higher income allows individuals to buy more time not working, just as it allows them to buy other consumption items. Many welfare programs, in addition to providing this additional income, are structured with fairly steep benefit reduction rates that phase out benefits as earned income grows. This, we've seen, provides another work disincentive. If work reduces the benefit amount, there will be a reason for individuals to substitute leisure, which is now less expensive, for consumption. This is a largely unavoidable incentive created by the combination of cash benefits with the phase out as earned income rises. For any of this to inform policy, however, we need to understand more about the magnitude of these effects on work effort. To do this, we need to understand a bit more about how economists and other social scientists do research to measure the effects of welfare programs on work and other behaviors. The challenge, similar to the challenge for much research in social science, is that we often cannot do this study in a controlled laboratory setting. Conceptually, we'd like to be able to randomly assign poor individuals to two different groups. One group could be offered welfare support and the other group nothing. Then we could simply compare how much the two groups work. Because they had been randomly assigned to the groups, with large enough samples, there would be no other reason to suspect that their behaviors would differ. Ideally, we would have observed these groups before any welfare benefits were offered as well, and the results of our experiment could tell us how much the offer of welfare benefits changed their work choices. Unfortunately, this is usually impossible to do. We can't randomly deny existing welfare benefits to eligible individuals, and since most safety net programs are long-standing in the U.S., it's not usually possible to observe behavior before the programs existed. As an alternative, social scientists use a variety of approaches and statistical methods to try to approximate this type of experimental evidence. While the inability to conduct laboratory-type experiments is a broad challenge for social science, there is a more specific challenge when trying to untangle the relationship between work and welfare availability. Ultimately, we're trying to understand whether and to what extent welfare causes low or reduced work effort. A starting point would be to observe the correlation between those receiving welfare and their work status and effort. Unfortunately, the interpretation of such a correlation in this case is challenging. What we really want to know is whether and to what extent welfare use causes the low work effort. Using available data, imagine that we see that those using welfare also tend to have relatively low levels of work. Unfortunately, we still can't say whether welfare caused the low work effort or if low work effort led to welfare use. In fact, we know that low work effort and low income are required to be eligible for means-tested welfare programs. This makes clear that we have to go beyond simply observing work and welfare use to reach meaningful conclusions. In the face of this challenge, social science researchers have come up with a number of different approaches that are more convincing than these simple comparisons. First, some studies look across U.S. states to see if welfare recipients in states with higher benefits or other relatively generous aspects to their welfare programs work less than those in less generous states. This approach is appealing because we don't think that individual work decisions or choices are likely to influence the policy decisions of how many benefits to offer or other program rules at the state level. This approach can be even stronger if we combine cross-state comparisons with changes in policy at the state level. In this case, imagine two states with identical welfare programs in an initial year, and then assume that one of them chooses to raise benefits. We could then focus on whether the increase caused individuals in that state to change their level of work effort, and perhaps come even closer to isolating the causal relationship between welfare and work. One drawback to this type of approach is that often states may change multiple aspects of their policies all at once. Following welfare reform in 1996, states were encouraged to experiment and modify their TANF programs to find the best mix of rules. Unfortunately, this means that a before-after state-level research design may have trouble discerning what specific feature of the welfare program is driving any observed changes in work or other behavior. What do we know about the magnitude of work responses to cash welfare programs? Prior to welfare reform in 1996, there were many studies of AFDC, and many of these studies used a combination of state-level comparisons and policy changes within states over time as the basis for their study. Economist Robert Moffat has conducted many such studies and has summarized much of the related literature. He finds that the AFDC program taken as a whole reduced hours worked by single-parent welfare recipients by somewhere between 10 and 50%, or a bit more than 500 hours per year. A more recent study actually used data from several decades ago when a welfare program was first introduced to better identify how the program affected work behavior. Economists Hilary Hoynes and Diane Schanzenbach looked at how the introduction of the food stamp program county by county in the late 1960s and early 1970s affected rates and hours of employment. In that study, the authors used the fact that, when the food stamp program began, it was introduced in specific counties over a period of several years. By looking at counties before and after food stamps were offered, they had an effectively random division of individuals into those who lived in states where the food stamp program started early and those where it started later. Specifically, they could look at counties where the food stamp program did not yet exist and compare work levels in those counties with similar counties that offered the new food stamp program. The study found that the introduction of the food stamp program in a county resulted in hours of work falling by 183 hours per year, or about 20% among single-parent families. They found no clear change in hours of work from the introduction of food stamps among two-parent families. With this approach, the effect of 183 hours reflects the likely effects on individuals who participated or received food stamps, roughly 32% of single-parent households, but also averages their response with the probably zero response of the many families who did not participate in the food stamp program. Fortunately, we can take this overall effect and the program participation rate of 32% and use it to recover the likely effect on hours of work among those who did receive food stamps, to isolate the negative work incentives for a typical program recipient. To do this, simply note that the overall effect of 183 hours of work can be expressed as the fraction of those receiving food stamps multiplied by the effect on labor supply for those recipients, plus the fraction not receiving food stamps multiplied by the effect for this group on labor supply, likely to be zero. This allows us, through some simple arithmetic, to estimate that the existence of the food stamp program likely caused those who received benefits to reduce their hours of work by roughly 571 hours per year, remarkably close to the earlier estimate for AFDC. Whether these numbers seem large or small is certainly a matter of judgment. They do make clear that there are negative work incentive effects from U.S. safety net programs, but safety net programs also clearly do not cause all participants to stop working entirely. For today's welfare system in general, and TANF specifically, we should also remember that in addition to the basic program features of benefits and a benefit reduction rate, we also now have certain work requirements. For many recipients, benefits are essentially unavailable if they do not work or participate in some work preparation activity. Thus, these older estimates of welfare's effects on work effort from earlier periods are likely an overstatement of the effect of the modern TANF program on work. Finally, there's one other source of information on how cash transfers affect work that comes from a variety of settings in the developing world. In recent decades, there have been a number of programs that provide cash supports in very poor countries where no such programs have existed in the recent past. Because there is no recent history of official support for the poor in these settings, it has been possible to run randomized experiments in which some of the poor are given cash transfers and others are not. This has allowed for some additional evidence on how welfare programs may affect work. It's important to note that most of these programs were simple cash transfers with no benefit reduction rates for increased work, and so they acted like the very simplest of our welfare program models. They simply produced a shift out in the budget constraint for the treatment group that received transfers. For the control group, randomly selected not to receive these transfers, there was no change in income. The results from a number of such studies are illustrated here. If providing cash assistance reduces work effort, We would expect the treatment group shown in this figure to have a smaller probability of working and a smaller number of hours worked relative to the control groups. In fact, we don't see much evidence of this. If anything, the treated groups seem to work slightly more, and in most cases, differences are very small. This leaves us with, for a population from developing countries, very little systematic evidence that cash transfers cause major reductions in work among the poor. This is a stronger statement than that made by the conclusions of US-based studies of AFDC, food stamps, and TANF, and may in fact be less relevant in the US, a developed and relatively wealthy country. Overall, evidence from the experience of the US safety net confirms that providing cash and other forms of assistance to the poor does cause some individuals to reduce their work effort. Recent evidence suggests that availability of a safety net program without specific work requirements could reduce hours of work in a year by 500 or 600 hours per year. Most individuals, however, do not reduce their labor market involvement to zero. Evidence from randomized experiments in developing countries seem to suggest even smaller labor supply responses to cash assistance. Estimating the magnitude of responses to incentives produced by changes in individual budget constraints is an important addition to simply understanding the theoretical prediction of such responses.